Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Today we've got a special guest, really considered a friend of the show now. He's been on so many times. Jay Anglin is a freelance contributor who does a bunch of work for Ducks Unlimited magazine and ducks.org. Welcome to the show, Jay.
Hey, it's great to be here, Chris.
Jay is actually working on an off-season tactics piece that is focused towards calling. And he's called around, talked to some different experts about what duck hunters are doing during the off season as in regards to duck calling, goose calling, just calls in general. So we figured we'd hop on here, just have this quick conversation, kind of focused towards what we always consider as the year-round waterfowler. I mean, middle of summer, we're looking for things to do. But Jay, let's kind of get into what are some of the things that you're hearing these experts say, some of the best things to do during the off season as far as duck calling.
Well, I've talked to several guys, and some that, I'm going to quote for that particular piece. And then I've spoken to some other guys more just in conversation. And, it's the things that we think of, during the season. And then as soon as the season's over, we just hang them on the hook or throw them in the drawer and just forget about it until, right before the season. That's what a lot of guys do. That's what I do. I'm not a professional caller. I've never said I was, or I don't even know that I've ever aspired to be. But the bottom line is it seems like every year, your calls are not in the greatest shape coming into the season unless you bought a new one or what have you. But nonetheless, really call maintenance is one of the first things that comes up. You talk about duck calls. There's probably not quite as much maintenance associated with them as, say, a short reed goose call. In particular, calls that are blown hard. Like I blow the calls really hard. Sort of that Tim Brown style where you really put a lot of air into it. And I was talking to Bill Saunders about it out in Washington, and Bill actually texted me a photo of a call that came in for maintenance a couple weeks back, and it looked like it was dipped in like chocolate frosting or I can't even describe it. He said, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, so, there's a call that probably got used every weekend, through the season. The guy obviously chewed a little bit, and there was a lot of stuff in that call. He said it's the worst one he's ever seen. And the photo, I'll have to send it to you. It's pretty remarkable, but those are the things, a lot of guys never even pull the insert out. So with duck calls, other than, the tuning, especially with a J frame, is very simple. It really isn't any. You just set it in there and boom, you're off to the races. But cleaning is really important. And, I talked to Fred Zink about that one time, and he told me that he does it throughout the day. He said, if I'm drinking pop or sweetened coffee or I've eaten candy, the sugars get on the reed, they change the pitch. Eventually they'll cause them to stick. So he's constantly cleaning his reeds. And with a J frame, that is so easy. Because again, you can pull the insert, slide it out, put everything back together, and you don't have to be an expert call tuner to do that.
Yeah, and are people, when they tear them apart, are they, is it like a soapy water mixture or just water or just kind of a readjustment, just kind of maybe wiping it down a little bit with a paper towel or anything you're hearing along those lines?
Yeah, so, like if you're in the field, it's one thing, like Fred always said, you rinse your mouth out with a little water and you put the reeds in your mouth and you kind of clean them off and blow everything off. If you have to use water, use it. But as far as an actual cleaning, just like we clean our guns when we tear them down, we take them apart. If it's not, disgusting, there really isn't a whole lot you can, that you have to do. You can run it under some water and rinse it off. And personally, what I like to do, and a couple guys mentioned this that I spoke to, is you take a Q-tip and you kind of swirl it around into the barrel, and then also into the insert, like in a duck call where you've got the opening underneath the reeds. You can kind of dab that out a little bit with just a wet Q-tip. And again, like you said, you just take a cloth of some kind and it's kind of common sense stuff. But, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, how many times have I genuinely done this over the years? And I'm kind of embarrassed to say that I really never started paying much attention to it until recent years. And I've got a whole pile of calls I pulled out and I'm like, wow, look at this thing. It's filthy. Clean it up. make sure the reed's okay and it's intact, and then it sounds great. So there's probably a lot of guys out there with a big old drawer full of calls, and they can go through and clean them and maybe even change a reed out if it's necessary, and they'd have a new duck call,
Yeah, and I know I'm probably just as guilty of that as most other callers. My calls tend to spend a lot of time hanging in the garage during the off season, and probably not enough time me practicing. But I also have drawers full of calls that I've just kind of maybe fallen out of love with, or just kind of moved away from because I feel like the sound is different. And this may be a good solution to an opportunity, really, to provide a solution to get those calls back running. And it might be like just having a brand new call. So yeah, I'm definitely gonna do that. And I've also seen guys who are using, especially in the field, one little tip, and we've had several articles written about it in the past where guys are using dollar bills and they're sliding them underneath the reeds, and that kind of knocks out some debris or whatever. Maybe there's some gunk buildup, like you said, some something from a soda or some sugars that are built up in their coffee, whatever. Just kind of knocks out some of that debris, and it gets the calls clean. Other than just cleaning calls, which most of us sounds like need to work on. What other tips are you hearing? I know you've mentioned there was a guy, someone had mentioned to you about goose calling it, but having your dog there, or using your dog as sort of as part of that calling practice.
Yeah. So George Lynch, Lynch Mob calls. He's a vast wealth of knowledge, and one thing I've always really appreciated about George is that he's like, I guess, the biologist in me, the scientist, sort of like an analytical guy. I always like to really peel away the layers. And he's like that, where he goes out like most, elite waterfowl hunters that really study birds and study the craft of it. He never was satisfied. He's never been satisfied with just saying, okay, they do this. So he likes to go out and observe birds this time of year and throughout the summer months into the fall, or into, late summer, early fall. But he said, the one thing he's noticed is that if you're not encumbered by, and distracted by calling and staying down and communicating with the other guys, you can really focus on the birds and really see the way they react to each other naturally. But what he said I thought was really interesting is he said, you take a dog with you and you make the dog heel, like you get out of the truck and lean against the truck and make the dog heel and observe the birds at, relatively close range. And it really helps them, mature and get used to the excitement of all the noise and clatter and the birds are moving around. And that's really great advice when you think about it, because dogs get amped, man. They live for this, as we do, but dogs, can't express it like we can, other than just freaking out a little bit. And early in the season, that's a really common thing. I really think that was a great bit of advice on his part, because you really are you have multiple things that are going on there that are very advantageous.
Yeah, and you want the dog to get used to the vocalizations, like you said, seeing the birds. Sometimes the birds are coming into land, and having that dog heel and stay. And is George calling while he's doing these? Is he throwing a couple of calls in there himself, or does he have his calls or something like that?
Yeah. He did say that as the season progresses, he'll tend to try to replicate the sound of the birds. And of course, if you got a guy like that who can pretty much sound more like a Canada goose than a Canada goose, he probably didn't have to practice a whole lot. But some of the really innovative sounds that in recent years that have become popular at the contests were sounds that really couldn't be replicated by calls that we had, 25, 30 years ago. It was great. It was very difficult. But now, with the variety of calls we have, with the short reed calls, the different barrels and the different inserts and the way they're tuned, it's really amazing how realistic they sound. So certainly he did say that was one of the ways that he really got, to the point where it was, next level for him, is that he started to call to the birds, not just during the season. And I think that could be said for a lot of guys that really know what they're doing.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
The other thing, this is a good time to bring it up, is the reed thing. And with goose calls, once you start really performing with a short reed, It's kind of like a buddy of mine used to say. He was a hot rod guy. He loved hot rods. And he said they always run the best right before they blow up. And, so, he's like, everything's loosened up. Everything's running at the razor's edge. And that's kind of with goose calls the same way. And I can relate to it. I blew up 3 reeds this year, and the last day of the season, never let up all day, big crew of guys, sketchy birds. And I went from a fresh reed that morning to a smoked reed at the end of the day. I mean, that's getting it. But a lot of guys don't even know what to look for with a blown reed. And, one of the things you look for, those blisters, as Bill Saunders refers to them, these little white spots that develop along the trailing edge or the leading edge of the reed. Eventually, that's just the reed splitting inside. And, eventually those grow and grow. And sometimes they add some really cool sound to a reed, but that's a very short time period. Normally, eventually, they just go away.
Yeah, that's your hot rod stage right there.
That's right. And so you get to the point where, okay, I got to change this reed. And I used to be very intimidated by it. Now I tune calls in the field like so many guys do. But if you're uncomfortable with it, man, you throw it in an envelope, a padded envelope, and you send it to the manufacturer. And those guys can tune that thing in 90 seconds and make it sound like a brand new, a call. And they might put a new reed in it and send you a couple extras. Who knows? But that's really great advice, because I see a lot of guys are like, oh, this thing doesn't work anymore, and they throw it in a drawer. Well, that's great for selling $180, acrylic goose calls. But in the big scheme of things, if you've got a 25-cent reed that you could put in there and make it sound like the day you bought it, it's a pretty good option,
Oh, yeah. Now, when you're out, do you have several reeds for your calls that you're carrying with you, or, additional calls, or, are you just switching them out right there in the field?
Yeah, I always carry, I usually, if I'm planning on goose hunting, if it's duck season and I think I might see a goose, I'll just put a really well-tuned good goose call on my lanyard, maybe, one, and then keep one in the bag. But when it's goose season and, everything's crazy with, the temperature ranges can change the pitch of a call. Maybe one day you're a little congested, you got some crud going on from a cold, all those things come into play. So I usually carry at least 3 Canada calls. And I usually have 2 extra reeds. I usually have a shaved reed and an unshaved reed. That's what I do. But again, you got to be comfortable tuning a goose call. And my thing about that is that, you take a call apart and you tune it and it sounds awful. And you just keep messing with it, preferably when there's not other people around, because they're going to want to throw a book at you. But until you get good at it, and then you're comfortable with it. So with each call I have, they're my go-tos, and I'm sure that, a lot of the guys I talked to over the years, I've gleaned this from them, as far as pros go, telling me, hey, I'll tell you something. Once you've tuned the same call 2 or 3 times, it becomes a lot easier to tune that call down the road with cold, wet hands in a field somewhere, because you smoked a reed. So that's another thing that, during the off season, I know it's tough, but if you want to learn how to tune a goose call, or a duck call, depending on what style it is, take it apart, mess with it, play around. And if you hit a brick wall after the 3rd try, again, you put it in the little padded bag and you send it back to the manufacturer, and they're going to make it perfect for you again.
Yeah. I mean, most manufacturers that I know, they're more than happy to, for the cost of shipping, typically go ahead and put a new reed in that thing, tune it up, and send it right back to you. That's fairly common across the board. And I think, definitely our listeners should probably look into that. And you could probably reach out and shoot an email to just about any call maker out there and say, hey, can you tune this for me? And almost every single one of them is going to say absolutely. And probably even some of them will give you tips on how to tune it yourself after they send you back, the fully tuned call. So keep that in mind for sure. Is there anything else that you've heard, just kind of some off-season duck calling, goose calling tactics, anything on the spec line, or, anything, any other goose or duck calling tip that you may have?
Well, I got to tell you, with the spec thing, I know where you live, you encounter specs from the second you get out of the truck until the second you're headed to the expressway. Up here where I live in northern Indiana, they're really kind of a new thing, and I'm learning as I go. And I know I've asked you some questions about what calls you prefer, but I would say that anybody that lives where they've seen, a couple hundred specs, during the season, or in our case, we're at times have tens of thousands of them around here. I'm just learning how to spec call, really, in the big scheme of things, but I'm carrying a couple different spec calls. And anytime they're around, I call to them, I work with them. Because again, that goes back to what George Lynch said about observing birds. This is the first time I've really observed specks other than, maybe a conservation order hunt in Nebraska or South or, Missouri or what have you, where you're seeing a few specks during the spring. But that really has been great. That's a good thing. I guess what I'm saying is that a lot of guys just go buy a spec call and learn how to use it, because the day's coming when you're probably going to need it, whether you think it or not. So there's that. I would also add that when it comes to tuning goose calls, I learned a really big lesson one time in recent years. A lot of the calls you buy are tuned, I guess for lack of a better term, kind of generically. They're tuned for every caller. But some of us tend, you know what I'm saying? But some of us tend to blow calls a little different. We might have a softer air, push of air, or in my case, I'm blowing the guts out of it. And neither one of them's right or wrong, but that's just the way it is. So I was actually at Zinc Calls, and I had a brand new acrylic goose call in my hand, and I was blowing it, and I just wasn't getting it to break the way I liked. And I handed it to Jimmy Wren, who of course is, learned how to blow a goose call when he was about 5 years old on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And I handed it to him, and I said, I'm blowing it too hard. And he took it out of my hands, and he literally touched it like for a second, and he handed it back to me, and it was perfect. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is when you start to tune calls, you can make adjustments. If you like to have the call break a little harder, if you like it to be a little softer tone, that'll lock up and stick when you blow it too hard. Those are all things you need to make sure to let the manufacturers know. If you send it in and you say, hey man, this thing's a wreck, make sure to say, if they don't ask, say, hey, look, I tend to blow the call really, really hard. I blow reeds, and they're going to more than likely, those minute little adjustments they make, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, we're talking infinitesimal amount of difference in the way that reed is set, and it'll make all the difference.
Yeah, that's a good point. Some people need to know that there are the way that people call, whether it's good goose calling or duck calling, the amount of air pressure put into it, the amount of back pressure needed, it's different for almost every person. And so, being able to make those adjustments and understand that just because you pick up that call and it doesn't sound exactly the way that you want it, you can still adjust that, or have someone adjust it for you, which is probably, for even, a beginning caller, that's probably the best bet. And being able to go into it and tell someone like, hey man, like I'm not putting that much from, I'm not blowing the guts out of it like Jay Anglin here. I'm a much softer, not putting near as much air in it here. And they can make that adjustment for you and make it sound exactly the way that you're looking. Especially when you get into goose calling, when you're getting into, like you had mentioned, some of these, off tones, the clucks and growls and some of these things that do get a little more advanced. You need the full capacity of the call itself, to accommodate what you're trying to do. So now, Jay, this has been great. This is, really good information. Guys are now going to be out and ladies be out, probably getting, like you said, a book thrown at them this summer for, sitting out in the garage or sitting in the house, blowing on a duck or goose call, trying to tune calls and fix things up and get things right. But now's the time to do it. Like you'd mentioned, the summer, you don't want to get caught middle of the season, not knowing what you're doing with an untuned call. Now's the time to do it. Now's the time to tweak all of that and get it exactly where you want it before the season kicks up. So, hey, I appreciate you joining me. Thanks a lot for coming on, man.
It's always great to be here. I love it. So you guys out there, get those calls out and get to work.
Perfect, man. I appreciate it. I'd like to thank our producer, Clay Beard, for putting together these podcasts. I'd like to thank all of you, our listeners, for joining us and making this podcast happen. And I'd like to thank you all for supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.